Hello, everybody. My name is Amy Lightfoot. I work for the British Council here in India, and I'm very pleased today to be introducing Professor Renu Singh. Just before we begin, I'd like to say a special hello to everybody watching our webcast session, as this is being webcast live on our website. And at the end of Renu's talk, we will be taking some questions. And if anybody watching the webcast would like to ask a question, they can do it through our Twitter hashtag, which is #TEC15. We're very lucky to have Professor Renu Singh with us today. She's going to talk to us about whether or not we are supporting teachers to address the diversity of students in their classrooms. She'll speak for about 45 minutes, and then, as I said, we'll have time for a question and answer at the end. So I hope you'll join me in welcoming Renu to the podium.
Good morning, everybody. Give me your hand mic. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be amongst all of you, and hello to everybody watching the webcast. I think you've had a very exciting 1.5 days already. So I'm going to be talking about what is happening within the classroom based on a research that we are doing in Andhra Pradesh and Telangana. So how many of you are from Andhra Pradesh and Telangana here? Okay, we have one person here. Okay, so the presentation will be focusing on the education context, moving on to an introduction to a longitudinal study called Young Lives, some of our key education findings, and also a research that we've conducted looking at teaching quality and student achievement. And of course, moving on to the last bit, which will be on policy implications. So if you, all of you coming from the education sector would already be aware that we have made huge strides in terms of increasing enrollment in the last few years. So if you see the total number of children in 2000 and 2001 were just about 156.6 million, and this has increased to 198.9 million in 2013-14. Which is in elementary education, which is grades 1 to 8, which is a huge success. And I think much of this has to be attributed to the policy context and all the work I think that you all are doing involved in Sarv Shiksha Abhiyan, the Right to Education Act, moving on to now RMSA, which is now making sure that even secondary education becomes universalized. So a lot of work has happened in the last few years. Of course, I think we also have the 12th five-year plan, which has supported the fact that the emphasis was on equity along with access, and more importantly, quality and governance. I think those are the 4 pillars of the 12th five-year plan. And if you read the 12th five-year plan, it clearly said that the greatest emphasis is now going to be laid on improving learning outcomes at all levels. So I think today, India is not just satisfied with just having access, and getting children enrolled. What we're very concerned about is learning outcomes for all children within schools. But if you look at the NCERT 2012 National Achievement Survey, which is NAS, for grade 8, it still showed that SC children, ST children, and other backward categories scored significantly lower scores than students in the general category, which means there is still some sort of stratification that is still happening, which is not allowing children to come at par, especially for the most disadvantaged children, in spite of all these wonderful efforts that we've been putting in. And of course, I think what is also happening is there is this sudden growth of the private low-fee charging schools. So we've always had the elite private schools, but now you see private schools mushrooming across the length and breadth of the country. Would you agree with me on that? Yes? You see that even in a small village, you will find private schools, yes? Okay. So I think this is another very important piece that we have to keep in mind as we are planning today. And of course, NCF 2005, and I think all of you must be aware now, a new national policy for education is just at this point being evolved. And please do go to the website, which has actually got a platform for people to put in their thoughts about it. So do log in, just when you go back home, because it's very important that your practical experiences should feed into the national policy for education. So going back to this, NCF, of course, emphasized that quality and extent of learner achievements are primarily determined by teacher competence, teacher sensitivity, as well as teacher motivation. And I heard many of you talk about that in the last session, yeah, those of you who were here. And I think Justice Verma Commission report has actually been a trigger to actually look at teacher education reforms, and form a trigger towards moving towards new ways of thinking, revamping the courses, the pre-service courses, as well as the in-service courses. So I'm going to give you a little bit of information about Young Lives. So this is a unique international study of childhood poverty in 4 countries, Ethiopia, Peru, Vietnam, and India. I work for the Young Lives India team. And we are in India, we are in Andhra Pradesh and Telangana, and we have been, in each of the 4 countries, we've been tracking 3,000 children since 2002, the same 3,000 children. We go back to their households, we interview the children, we do household interviews, and we also do community interviews. It's a pro-poor sample, so we don't have middle class, upper middle class, rich children in this sample. It's a pro-poor sample. So we're looking at, and why are we doing a longitudinal study? Because we want to look at the causes and consequences of childhood poverty, and also to see what is the impact of the policies. In this last 12 to 15 years, there have been so many new policies that have been initiated. How have these actually impacted children? And because we are tracking children from infancy till early, adulthood, young adulthood, we can actually see the life course cycle through the longitudinal research. These are the 2 samples that we have within each of the countries. We have an older cohort who were 8. If you look at this, they were 8 when we started in 2002. And they now, in the 4th round in 2013, turned 19. Yeah. This is the older cohort. And the younger cohort were just between 6 months to 1 year. And now they are 12 years in 2013. The last round that we completed, the 4th round of survey, was in 2013. We're now just getting ready for our last round, which is round 5, in 2016, when the older children will be 22 and the younger children will be 15. And you can see that because it's a longitudinal research, we can actually compare the 8-year-olds in 2002 with the 8-year-olds in 2009. And you see how we can then compare how 8-year-olds are doing? In the last round, or 4th round, we could compare the 12-year-olds in 2013 with the 12-year-olds in 2006. So we can actually look at how new policies have impacted another cohort of children at the same age and can draw conclusions from that. So in Andhra Pradesh and now Telangana, because when we began the study in 2002, of course, we only had Andhra Pradesh. We are now in 4 districts in Andhra Pradesh and 3 districts in Telangana. So we are in Srikakulam, West Godavari, Bayasar Kadapa, Anantapur. And in Telangana, we are in Mehboob Nagar, Hyderabad, in the old city, and Karim Nagar. Yeah. So we have a sample in these in 98 villages, 98 communities, and we do both quantitative and qualitative research with them. So there are both quantitative and qualitative, equal number of boys and girls, and it was a very scientific sampling. This study is run out of University of Oxford. So there is a huge research rigor to this, and our partners in India are CES, in Begumpet in Hyderabad, SPMVV in Tirupati, that's Sri Padmavati Mahila Vishwavidyalaya, the Women's University which does the qualitative work, and Save the Children is our policy partner. So in this research, we have a child questionnaire, we do cognitive achievement tests. In each round, we check how children are faring in language and maths. We also have a household questionnaire to see changes, wealth index, whether there has been a death in the family, any loan burdens, health expenditure, because all this impacts education as well. You know, we can't just see education within the classroom. You have to look at factors outside. What drives children to leave school, for example. And in 2011, we realized that we were not observing classrooms, because if you only go and interview children and interview parents and communities, you get perceptions of schooling. What do people think about schooling? But you don't really understand what are the processes within the classroom. So then we undertook a school-based survey in 2011, and the research that I'm going to talk to you about today is from there. In round 4, our older cohort turned 19, and just to tell you, this is not part of this presentation, but 37% of our girls were already married at 19, and we had 128 babies from the older cohort. So in Andhra Pradesh, Telangana, child marriage still continues. Okay, so let's look at what's happening at age 12. Now, I told you we could compare the 12-year-olds in 2006 with the 12-year-olds in 2013. And you can see there is an increase from 89% enrollment to 97%. Almost everybody age 12 is in school. That's the good news. Yeah, almost everybody. And if you look at the SC, STs, OCs, BCs, there is hardly any child who's left out of school. There's more than 96% even in the STs. Yeah? So there is an improvement since 2006, and I think that's the good news, that enrollment has definitely shown a marked improvement, not only in Andhra Pradesh, Telangana, I think this is across the board. And if you look at, because we have all information about households, we can actually divide the households into the least poor and the poorest. So if you look at the bottom tercile, which means the poorest families, you can see that even here, almost 96% of your children are in school. So this is across wealth terciles, or even poorest households are sending children. And if you look at urban, rural also, you find that rural, yes, it's marginally less than the urban areas. So very good news in terms of that. But what is also happening is, in 2009, when we did the third round, we found that 44% of our children aged 8 had gone to private schools, as compared to 22% in 2002. Remember, we had 8-year-olds in 2002, older cohort. If you compare them, only 22% were in private schools. In 2009, it had doubled. It became 44%. So many more from the poorest households also now going into private. These are all low-fee charging schools, by the way. Our schools are not the elite schools. These are the 200 rupee school, the 300 rupee school, yeah, most of them, okay? So if you look at the gender and caste differentials, now at 12, it had come down from 44 to about 40.2. So marginally decreased from 8 to 12, yeah? This is the 12-year-olds in 2013. You've got about 41% almost in private schools overall. But if you look, you've got 45% of the boys in private schools, vis-a-vis, 33% girls. But look at the other castes. 70% of other caste children as compared to 22% SCs and 21% STs. Even this is a huge number. That means almost a quarter of your SCs and STs are also going to private schools. That's what it's coming to. But other castes, 70% are in private schools. Yeah? So what is happening? There is a segregation here based on caste that's happening very clearly. Yeah? Also, if you look at the place of residence and wealth, you can see that, your top terciles, those are the wealthiest, 72%. And, this is very interesting because you've got almost the same of other castes and the wealthiest in private schools. So I would imagine much of the other castes are anyway in private schools. And what does we have qualitative research? So look at what Supraja's mother is saying. Sure. Certainly. Please stop me. You're talking about the place of residence? Okay. So if you look at the place of residence, you've got about 77.6% urban children in private schools, vis-a-vis only 26% in rural areas. Okay? Huge difference. So almost everybody in urban areas who has little money will go definitely to private schools. Now this is something we need to start worrying about. What is happening here? We also have, if you look at the bottom tercile, which means the poorest children, you've got about 15% of the poorest children. This is based on household wealth across urban and rural areas going to private schools. But if you look at the least poor, 72% of them are going to private schools. So can you see what is happening here? How choices are being made? Yeah, and we can, later I can show you how this is happening across time as well, and how it's been steadily increasing, the shift into private, low fee charging. This is all low fee charging, not the elite private schools. Yeah. So this is a quote from one of the mothers. We interview parents, and Supraja's father is a mason, and mother is a housewife. And the family has opted for a private school, which they can ill afford. So what is Supraja's mother saying? She's saying in government school, teachers are not bothered if the child does not come to school. In private school, if my daughter is absent, they send a message home and ask for the reason that the child is absent. They take good care. This is perception of mother, yeah? And this is why choices are being made. So like I mentioned to you before, if you were to divide the households into 4 groups, that means this is the poorest, this is less poor, yeah, and this is the least poor. Least poor out of a pro-poor sample. You can see 83% of your children who are least poor, yeah, 86% of the least poor children are in private schools. This is the private school, yeah, these are all private schools, yeah. And only 16% of the poorest in private schools. Just the opposite in the public schools. 13.9% of the least poor in government schools. Yeah, and 84% almost of the poorest in government schools. Just the opposite. Yeah, sorry. So you can almost see that wealth is determining the choice of school. That's what is very evident from this data. So worry is now that, yes, I just told you almost 97% universally are in school, whether it's government or private. Children are going to school now, and that's the good news. But look at what's happening in terms of same questions we asked. In the blue is 2006. How many children answered the same maths questions we asked in 2006? Same questions asked in 2013. There is a dip in the total scores in 2013. Many more children going to school, but learning levels are falling. And look at this. So if you look at the average score in 2006 and 2013, this is for the government schools. Yeah, the first, this one. This is the government school. So you can look at this. 69% answer the questions correctly in 2006, and this has come down by 20 percentage points to 49% in government schools. But in private schools also it has come down. So whereas it was 60 for the government schools in 2006, it was higher even at that time in the private schools, which was 74% answered correctly. This has also come down to 62. So there's a dip even in the private schools. This is over time. Same questions asked. Now the question is, why is this happening? And we need to really know. Many more children are coming to school. But even the private sector, it's not just the government school, even in the private sector, the learning levels are declining. And there is something we need to worry about. Just remember we said talk about the policy context. In the policy context, what is new since 2006? You've got the RTE, but what has RTE done in terms of change? No detention policy is a new policy, remember that, yeah? They never used to be in 2006, there was no detention policy existing. Now we suddenly have this new policy. Just a thought, food for thought to think about. That's the new thing that has happened. So what are parents saying? They're saying in municipal schools, This is another parent. He's saying, teaching imparted is below standard. Teachers are indifferent to the plight of students as they are paid good salaries from the government. They are secure. They do not pay individual attention to the students. The classes are not held regularly and lessons are not taught properly. They do not teach the whole lesson. They just skim through it. And they also do not teach the answers to most of the questions. And they leave the children in a quandary. In case the children have any doubts, the teachers don't clarify. The teaching is haphazard. And they go on to say, whereas in private schools, which is low fee charging, teaching is good. Teachers ask each and every student individually whether they're able to follow the lessons properly. However, and the same parent says, nowadays the trend is changing even in private schools. They are blatantly telling the children to mug up the subject matter. The students are learning blindly without any insight into the subject. This is, we often say these are poor parents, they don't know. But parents are extremely insightful. They know what's happening. And these are parents' words. These are their words. So I'm just going to go on to the research. Now, we're looking at quality teaching. And just to start off, we're looking at the understanding of quality teaching as not just teaching that, just a task, but saying quality teaching must lead to learning. And if we believe that, and I guess everybody in this room will believe that, then we were talking, quality teaching will depend on a student learning, which means we label this sort of teaching as successful teaching. So any teaching that doesn't lead to learning would probably be in inverse unsuccessful teaching, right? So we're looking at quality from the perspective of learning outcomes. So we looked at a factor analysis of teaching quality as well as learning outcomes of children in both government as well as private low-fee charging schools. We measured teaching quality by teaching characteristics. We looked at things like experience, professional qualifications, we looked at gender, we looked at in-service training, we looked at all those things that we usually look at. We also looked at, from the teaching the teacher questionnaires, we looked at teachers' beliefs. Because we thought, we heard this morning people talking about teacher motivation. What are the teacher beliefs? Do they believe that their school is as good as other schools? Yeah, or is it worse than the schools nearby? Because that's a very important self-belief which leads to, that Pygmalion effect which we all know about. So we also looked at teaching practices. For example, we went into the classroom and we actually physically checked notebooks of children to see how many books had been corrected by teachers, rather than just looking. We also did classroom observations. Only today I'm not going to focus on the observations because another time I will do that, and this time is short. So the school sub-study in 2011, we have information on 953 children who were in 247 schools. So this data is from 247 government and private schools. We interviewed 357 teachers, we did 227 classroom observations, and we also interviewed DEOs and MEOs. For those of you who are not from Andhra Pradesh and Telangana, MEOs are the Mandal education officers. In Andhra Pradesh and Telangana, we have mandals instead of blocks, just above the block level. And we also did interview of caregivers and children in 2011 to understand, one of those quotes which I just shared with you was from those interviews with parents. What is your perception of school? We also interviewed parents of children who had changed schools very often. We found many of the children in private schools kept moving from one private school to another. So we interviewed all the children who had changed more than 3 schools till the age of 12. And believe me, there were so many of them. And one of the, I guess, obvious things was, this has become too expensive, or I'm not satisfied, and we move on. They move to another lower. Sometimes they can't afford because the fee suddenly is moved up. They increase the fee by 200 rupees, and the parent can't afford it. So those are some of the things that we saw. So this is, I know, I'm sorry, there are going to be now a few graphs, but I will try and make it simple, and not make it confusing. So if you look at the age of teachers in government schools was slightly more than, the mean age was about 33 years of teachers as compared to about 29, 28 years in private schools. Not so different, nothing significantly different. But what was very significant was that in government schools, you had many more male teachers than in private schools. Private schools was just the inverse. Yeah? So you had about 66% of the teachers in government schools who were male. This may not be a national figure because national statistics doesn't tell you that, but this is from our data that we found. And 30% only were men teaching in private schools, probably because of the salaries. Because if you look at the salaries, which is right at the end, government school teachers were paid at that. Remember, this is 2011. This is before all the 6-pay commission came in. So even at that time, it was almost 4 times the private school salary. So I guess the men will not take those jobs, I would imagine. But there is no research to that. That is just hypothetically. So of course, if you look at teacher training and you look at teacher experience, teachers in government school had much more experience, the mean age, than teachers in private schools. Yeah. Also, in terms of your in-service training, only less than 5% of the private school teachers got any in-service training, yeah? Whereas almost, you had 59, 60% of teachers who reported they'd had in-service training in the government school system. And yes, I just want to point out that school characteristics, whereas, we had 44% of the government schools with less than 60 children, yeah? This was only less than, 1% of the private schools had less than 60 children. So there are dwindling populations in the government schools. And 50% of the private schools, even the low-fee charging schools, had more than 250 children population. So school size, hugely disparate. So when we looked at student achievement, the dotted line is private schools, and this is the kernel density. This is the distribution of the scores. And you can see these are RASH scores that we've calculated for maths. And if you look at the mean of the private school, it is to the right of government school, which is around 17. That's the mean. So the entire distribution of the private school, you can see that is definitely the children in private schools are doing better. Yeah? I'm not going to give you, this is the regressions. We did a bivariate and then a multivariate regression. I'll move on. Won't confuse you. But just to say that just from the regression results, what do we find? I'm just going to give you some of the key things that came out as critically important in impacting learning outcomes. One of them was, of course, D.Ed, B.Ed, and M.Ed, vis-a-vis those teachers who had no qualification, secondary and senior secondary. They had 7 percentage point, at the minute the teacher was qualified, the students' learning outcomes increased by 7 percentage points. Now, even when we added, this is regression actually has lagged test scores. That means we did a regression by adding the test scores from 2 years before. So it actually compensates and it becomes dynamic, the whole regression. Even then, it remains highly significant at almost 6%. Yeah. The other thing that was very significant was teachers living in the same village had much higher scores. Now, this has huge implication because private schools, we found most of the teachers came from the same village, whereas the government school teachers, there is no teacher rationalization. Often they have to travel long distances. So therefore, absenteeism was more. The other thing was when children, this is children's reporting that teachers treated them fairly. Those that said, my teacher is fair to me, scores were much higher. That means where there was equity in the classroom, the scores went up. Yes, yes. The fifth thing was where the teacher believed that the school was better than or the same as the other schools in the community, outcomes were better. So the teacher belief came out as very significantly, very, very important. Now, often these are completely overlooked, because these don't seem to make it on the policy table, actually, in formulation. But I just want to say that from our classroom observations, which I'm not sharing, we found that in both private and government school, most of the time it was teacher-directed instruction. So I'm not going to say there was any difference in the pedagogy that was happening. But when we looked at this, I just mentioned to you, we actually looked at how many books had been corrected. We found 80% of the books in the private school had been corrected versus 36% in the government school. Huge difference. And this came out as a very significant factor. because the child was not getting any feedback in the government system, you know. Correction is also a way of giving feedback. And the Supraja's mother again says, you know, nobody bothers whether a child has done homework or not. They don't motivate the child to study well. And she carries on to say, whereas the private school teachers are scrupulously particular about all these things, they give progress reports and conduct tests regularly. So I think that was something that Supraja's mother felt was very important. The other missing piece was that a parent said, for private schools, we pay money, we can question them if children come home early or if they don't study well, and we won't send the children to school if they're not taught properly. But in government, the teachers come and they teach for the sake of the salaries, so they just come and go daily. This is the perception of a parent. So if you look at teacher absenteeism in public and private, you know, it was 39% in the month before we found there had been absenteeism of teachers in the school. And this was lower, but not so much lower. You know, it was at 30% in private schools. But look at the dismissals. The headmasters in the private school reported that they had dismissed almost 24% of them said we took stringent action against teachers who came late or who were absent. But of course, you know what happens in our government system. There are no actions taken. So governance was a huge issue. But along with this is the loan burden, and I want to highlight that because it's all very well to say children are doing better in the private schools, but what about the loan burden associated with private schooling for the poorest children? And here Supraja's mother again says, we have to raise money somehow and pay her school fees. Later, we try and clear the incurred loans. This is very burdensome. We will not have any savings as we spend everything on education. Strictly speaking, even people of our status cannot afford these schools. Now we have to send our child to an even lower rung private school. So what is happening is that there is a huge loan burden associated with this aspiration of moving children to a better school, English medium tag school. And if you look at the difference in average annual expenditure spent on school and extra tuition, huge difference in the government and private. So whereas in primary level, in the government, children talked about 87 rupees because this includes tuition. So even though school fee may not be there, but children spend on notebooks, they spend on other expenditure. So 87 rupees was the mean. This was, look at the amount, it's 3,357 was the mean for private schooling, low fee charging schooling. You know, including, this is the mean, so which means there would be, of course, outliers. And at secondary level, this increased considerably, which is almost double at 6,902. This is our children reporting the expenditure. So I think what we have to remember is that private schools are not the same, neither are government schools. Huge diversity within schools. That is the rider. And I would just want to share with you what a deputy inspector of schools said to us. He says, bias of parents towards private schooling is not healthy. Most of the private schools fail to maintain teaching standards and create a pressure cooker environment. Yeah, that was his way of looking at what's happening. And another official said, private institutions, and this is a government official, are demanding huge amounts of tuition, neglecting quality, but in order to induce belief in the government schools amongst the people, a multifaceted revolution has to come. So ultimately, our research showed it's not what the teacher knows, because when we did a teacher test, we actually tested teachers. Government school teachers knew much more in terms of content. But ultimately, it's what the teacher does that matters. And that's the crux of the matter. It is what the teacher does. So standard characteristics like experience, gender, content knowledge, actually subject specialization did not have any impact, no significant impact on learning outcomes. And I've already shared with you some of the things that had a significant outcome, like checking of books, teachers living in the same locality, believing the school was better than or the same quality as other schools. Also, professional qualifications, B.Ed, M.Ed came out significantly better learning outcomes for teachers than those with secondary, but there was no difference between B.A., M.A. and B.Ed, M.Ed. So this is another food for thought. Why is that so? Now we have the TET, and even those with B.Ed, M.Ed will not become teachers, but what about the B.A., M.A.s having the same learning outcomes? Most of them were in the private schools, by the way. So I think ultimately all I would end up saying is inclusive pedagogy is absolutely essential because you have the poorest children now coming into schools. and they should not be shortchanged. I think the poorest children deserve the most attention, in fact. So what do we have to do to address prevailing inequalities in society is to raise the bar in the government schools, which actually provide education for the poorest children. We cannot let those children down. We just can't. And I think we have to address the economic, structural, and the power relationships, because whether the power dynamics between parents and teachers, within the school and the community, how do we address those gaps? Also, huge implication on teacher professional development, I think. How are we preparing teachers to address this diversity? Are teachers prepared? And I think we just heard about the standards. And I just heard that in the standard framework that you just talked about in this preceding, I don't know how many of you were in the session before this, there's also something which is looking at inclusive practices, a whole domain within that framework. So how do we build those frameworks? So ultimately, it's what the teacher does and believes that counts. How do we build that in our teacher training programs? And all the teacher educators here have to definitely start assessing that change that comes through, rather than just content knowledge. You know, it's content pedagogical knowledge that is very important. We need to move from, I think, pure credentials to teacher competencies in the instructional processes, effectiveness addressing diverse needs. Are we actually assessing those? Also, I think private school entrepreneurs, and I'm calling them entrepreneurs because some of them are entrepreneurs, actually are accountable to children and parents. How do we build the same in the government school system? Because that's absolutely essential. Induction and I think mentoring must be strengthened, and teacher appraisals in the government school system and the private school system should be actually linked to STPs. We are all now creating school development plans. Are teacher appraisals even done and linked to children's outcomes? And if not, we need to definitely start working towards that. And of course, I think teacher management, teacher rationalization, so that teachers are located very close to their home and the school is near their home, needs to definitely take clear precedence in planning in the states and districts. And of course, CPD requires huge attention. And this is the last slide, don't worry. I hope I'm not overrunning time. So I think what we need to do is focus on equitable learning outcomes and a quality framework which actually reviews the curriculum, particularly the teaching learning processes within the classroom, and takes all this into account. And I think definitely we need to have these standards and frameworks that we can refer to in our everyday processes in the school. Monitoring and I think a supervisory body for developing and ensuring quality standards for teaching and learning, absolutely essential in our country, both for the public as the private aided and unaided schools. And I think I want to go back to what an MEO said, and MEO is again the Mandal Education Officer. He said, majority of the MEOs are in charge MEOs, yeah, and this is the same for DEOs, probably in other states. And under each, there are about 150 headmasters in schools. So they, first of all, they are in charge, so they have other associated responsibilities. Then they have 150 schools to look out for. And he says MEOs are unable to do their work properly. To solve this problem, we should allocate only 30 schools for each MEO to improve quality. Now, such a practical solution, and he's saying it from the ground. He's somebody on the ground who works in the schools. But I hope that would be taken into consideration. And I think, again, I've just said, teachers must be posted in schools closest to their home. Teacher rationalization has to become part of teacher planning, absolutely essentially. I'm going to end now to just say that there are lots of papers on our website, so you can, it's www.younglives-india.org, and you will find a lot of policy briefs and methods notes on our research, including round 4 fact sheets, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Renu. That was really very interesting, and I'm sure all of you will agree that what you've said really mirrors what we've been talking about for the rest of the conference so far, about all of the multiple variables that are involved with quality in education and how really complex and complicated it is. It'd be great to take some questions from the floor. Have we got our volunteers with the microphones ready? Excellent. Okay. We've got about 15 minutes, so let's see how we go. If you could keep your questions short and introduce yourself before you ask the question, that would be brilliant.
Thank you, ma'am, for your kind presentation. But you have, in detail, narrated the problems. This is the problem. What are the solutions? And what solution would you like to suggest to the government through your NGO or through we people, so that we can also put pressure in our capacity as master trainers, in our capacity as headmasters, in our capacity as principal, and in our capacity as teachers, and above all, in our capacity as the citizens of this free India. What solutions, some of the most important solutions that I would like to know from you. Thank you.
Thank you. Renu?
Would you like me to take questions together?
I think we'll do one at a time.
One
I think
time,
we'll,
okay.
yeah, we'll try that.
So I think I can stand. So I think if you go back to this last slide, can we just put this on again? Yeah, sorry. Yeah. So, we had some clear recommendations here to look at how do we build accountability systems, which means you need to strengthen supervisory bodies within the government and the private sector, for the private sector, especially with the RTE now. How do you have monitoring mechanisms, we've already talked about self-assessment being a very, very important tool, but you also need mentoring. You also need induction of teachers. These are all clear recommendations that we are saying. We also need teacher rationalization. Yeah? So how are we going to make sure that teachers live close to their school, or schools are close to their homes, whichever way you might want to see. We also want to make sure that there are some quality frameworks which actually allow equitable learning opportunities. If you're going to segregate children, so now you have the 25% reservation, right, for the poorest children, but that's not being done for the low fee charging schools. Yeah, it's not being implemented across the board. The minute the 25% of your children are given reservation and maybe coupons to go to private schools, there may be nobody left. I just showed you what's happening to this government school populations. They're shrinking over time. Yeah? So either you increase the quality of the government school or you'll have to shut down. There are no two choices. We have to make sure there is greater accountability to parents, and therefore your assessment evaluation frameworks have to be very clearly strengthened.
Thank you. I think there's also been some good news today from the announcement of the union budget. I don't know if any of you have had a chance to see this. Just very recently been announced, and there's been some positive news about budgets for education allocation and also for supporting minority youth and young children in rural areas. So that's also quite a good thing as part of the solution, obviously not the whole solution, quantity rather than quality again. But that's also very good. Okay, shall we take another question from the floor? Yeah. Please, at the front, yeah.
Thank you, madam, for your brilliant comparison and contrast, that is the private and the government schools. I think you have just given indicate that very good data. That data, teachers have active responsibilities and inclination their parents due to the responsibility of the teachers. I think that the responsibilities of the teachers and the inclination towards the private schools of the guardians, the main reason is behind among that the curriculum and English teaching method, they apply more. And you haven't mentioned about that, only mentioned something like mathematics. The fact is that private schools take birth, only one behind it, only one reason is that they apply their English teaching classes much more, I think. Don't you think so?
I didn't get that last point. What did you say, sir? If you could just repeat the last point.
My question, yes.
The last.
My question is that inclination of the guardians towards private schools. You have given the data. I think the reason behind the inclination towards private schools is the teaching English in those schools. And you haven't mentioned only mentioned about mathematics. So, don't you think that English is the reason behind it?
I think absolutely. In fact, I just deleted 2 or 3 slides because I realized I'd be running out of time just before this session. But I don't know whether I can plug on a new one, but I can tell you afterwards in the break. But we have data on language as well. So in fact, we asked children, because all the children going to private low-fee charging school obviously go there because it's English medium in name. We asked children, what language does your teacher teach you English in? Yeah? And I will show you that data. Less than 30% of the children in private schools said they were being taught in English. And I also will show you, we looked at the board results in English. The government school children did no worse than the private school children in the board results. But in our comprehension tests, we do English comprehension tests, the private school children did far better. Which means the board exam probably just doesn't really test comprehension. It tests what you learn by rote. And government school children, even though they're not going to English medium schools, will come up with equally good results. They may not have learned the language, but even the children in the private schools, very few private low-fee charging schools actually use English, even though they use the tag. And the tag is what is drawing children in, but that doesn't really mean quality. So I think quality is a problem even there. They may be better doesn't mean good. I think we need to be very clear about this. It's not good enough. It's better because they have that English medium tag, they might learn a few sentences. They do not learn the language. Our tests clearly demonstrate that. They do not have comprehension of English. So otherwise the hypothesis should be everybody going to private schools should have much better comprehension scores, right, in English. But that is not the case because children are telling us they are not really taught in English. So most of them said the medium of instruction is Telugu and English mix. You know, in Andhra Pradesh and Telangana. Some even talked of just the mother tongue and not English at all. So that is the reality on the ground.
And you would agree that what it is, but it's something that's attracting people to private schools, yes, is the having the English medium
100%,
label there.
100%,
yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Thank you for that question. Do we have any others? Yeah, I can see one back.
I'm Neeraja Reddy, working as Chief Tutor at District Center for English, Warangal. For the first question, your statement was close down the government schools. But private schools should not be given permission in the area where government schools are located. Teachers are not coming for salary's sake. We have SMCs, School Management Committee, which is very strong. They are part and parcel of government schools. And we have Right to Education Act where parent can question government school teachers. That is not applicable to private schools. So I request you, ma'am, we are not going, as a government teacher, we are not going for salary's sake. We are trying to work hard, but government has loopholes. They should not permit private schools. When expertise is there with them, they are not making use of us. How can you blame a government teacher?
Very interesting.
And ma'am, one more submission. Many primary schools, they have started English medium. And our Chief Minister, he promised recently, is going to give free education from KG to PG in English medium only. We are working, madam. Please draw back those words.
Can I ask you what state you're from, just so that everyone knows? Which state do you work in?
District Center for English. I'm on deputation. I work as a teacher trainer. I congratulate ma'am for the facts. Warangal, you know, I work in a remote village. I worked as a teacher from primary to high school. I have all the levels of children with me.
In Andhra Pradesh itself?
Yeah, Telangana.
Yeah. Okay, in Telangana. Okay,
Okay.
Renu, would you like to respond?
Thank you for that. I think it's very important to hear that side. And like I said, we interviewed MEOs and DEOs. So those are MEOs and DEOs in your state that we are quoting. None of this is coming from us. It's from the research, from the fact that, of course, all government teachers are not the same, all private teachers are not the same. Yeah. So like I said, it's not a homogeneous group. You cannot group everybody together and say everyone is like that, you know. So that is one given. Secondly, I think to say that we should not allow private school, I think private schools are actually what is triggering what your chief minister is just saying. It's the fact that children are choosing English medium schools that is actually triggered this whole thing, that maybe that is the aspiration of the parents and we should meet them. And I think that's a very good stand that they are taking. The only thing is, you have done this earlier as well, because in 2011, this was began as a pilot in a number of schools, English medium. And we have interviews of teachers in those schools saying it was a disaster because teachers didn't know how to teach in English. Teachers were not prepared. So I think if we want to go in the direction of turning into English medium schools, we need to make sure teacher preparation is in place, enough preparation, and also investment is made in the teachers, because it's not fair otherwise to expect that children will be taught in Telugu in English, for English.
Ma'am, one more submission. We have success schools. In each mandal, 5 English medium schools were started in high school. That was the mistake done by the government. It should have been started in the primary level.
Absolutely.
Now we made a survey recently. Anganwadi should be strengthened for pre-primary, so that will be the feedback to the primary.
Sure.
Then if primary is strengthened, then naturally high schools will be strengthened.
Sure. Sure. Very good point.
Thank you. Thank you for your question. So I think your point is it's healthy competition from the private
sector.
Yes, okay.
Absolutely.
I think we've got time for one last question. Now the lady I was going to ask us now. Ah, she's there in the orange top. Did you have a question? Yeah.
Hi Renu, my name is Ritu, I'm from Bangalore, and a fantastic presentation. I also see you doing a lot of work on the ground with the underprivileged children. My question was in the previous slide, the last slide that you showed on the next steps. In your experience, what's been the government's reception or the willingness to accept some of these suggestions that you've brought in?
So I think we've had a very receptive government. So I mean, this was when Usha Rani was SPD. I remember making this presentation immediately she made a government order which said, when we go to assess a school, supervise a school, look at how many books have been checked. She picked up the indicators from here. So I think we've been very lucky, because I think the state government has been very open, and we've been very open in sharing. In fact, the entire research that we did in schools was done with SCRT and DIETS as our collaborator. They formed the questionnaire, we made the teacher test together. So we do things in collaboration because we want this to become part of the government study itself, rather than seen as a young life study in isolation, because otherwise, so we do work very closely with the state government. And now I know there have been a lot of changes and we need to go back to them now that things are settling down in the 2 new states. But I'm sure that there will be very good reception to the research evidence. And what the lady just said, there was immediate, even when we talked about English medium and this whole aspect of parental perception when we shared, the secretary, I remember, Poonam Malkonda at that time said, let's quickly do an enrollment drive and do marketing like the private schools. Why can't we learn certain things from the private schools? So like you rightly said, we learn so much from competition. She said, can we also, so the Badi Bata, which was being done in the state, took on some of those marketing strategies, for getting young children into school and preparing them into transitions from the Anganwadis, etc. So I think the government is very open to suggestions. But it's for us researchers not to let it sit on our desktops and to reach out to larger audiences like yourself, because we alone cannot influence the government. It has to be a larger group of people like yourselves taking it on.
Thank you very much. And also, just to reiterate, can we just show the PowerPoint screen again? It'll come on in a second, but I think I'm right in saying that all the data you were saying earlier is available for anybody to have a look at and use in whatever way that you would like to. Yeah. So please do go to the website to follow that up if you're interested.
So any of you want to do research also, our data is publicly archived. Anybody can use our data. It's there for you to analyze. Nothing's hidden. It's all transparent. So please do use our data.
Okay. All right. I'd just like to say thank you again. If we could just have a big hand for Professor Renu Singh for her talk, and we have a small token of appreciation for you as well.